I've been the voice on the air for 6 years. The Weatherman feels like a title I stole. My scripts arrive via an ancient thermal fax machine bolted to the corner of my desk. It has no phone line. The power cord sits coiled on the floor like a dead snake, yet it screams to life. The paper it spits out is always cold, colder than the room. I don't remember how I even got this job. I don't remember the interview. I don't remember the application. I only remember the phone ringing in the middle of a dream and a voice telling me I started Monday. Now, I sit in the booth from sunrise to sunset, reading whatever the machine spits out. Someone has to tell them what's coming. Someone has to give them a chance to run. Most days, the machine, I call it the specialist, just groans. It hums with a low-frequency vibration that makes my teeth ache, eventually spitting out a tongue of thermal paper that reeks of scorched oil and old electricity. On the good days, the messages are boring. Light drizzle. Partly cloudy. The kind of news that lets me pretend I'm just a guy with a job. But then there are the other days. The specialist doesn't just hum on those days, it screams. It's a mechanical seizure, the sound of a paper shredder choking on bone and the high-pitched wail of a dying cat. When the paper finally slides out, the ink is still wet and oily. The paper feels like skin peeled from someone fresh out of the shower. I remember the first time the forecast changed. It didn't mention the sky at all. Heavy mist for the next 2 hours. If you hear knocking at your door, do not open it. Do not ask who is there. Or thunderstorms rolling in. If you see a dead relative in a reflection, do not acknowledge them. They are looking for an invitation. I have to read those words into the microphone. I have to keep my voice steady, even when I can feel the specialist watching the back of my head, waiting to see if I'll miss a syllable. Because out there, in the quiet houses and moving cars, people are listening. And I'm the only thing telling them how to stay alive. I'm not entirely alone in the station, though it often feels that way. There's Rick and Ashley. Ashley handles the local news and community updates. She's giddy. Too giddy. She moves through the dim hallways with a chirpy, caffeinated energy that feels like a serrated blade against the silence of the booth. She brings me coffee black, bitter, and smelling slightly of the same burnt oil as the fax machine, but she never looks at the specialist. She never asks why my weather reports sound like survival manuals. She just smiles, her teeth a little too white in the fluorescent light, and tells me to keep up the good work. Then there's Rick. Rick is the ghost in the machine. He's the one who keeps the lights from flickering out and the plumbing from backing up into the lobby. He's a man of grease stains and heavy sighs. We don't talk much, which suits me. He just moves through the peripheral of my vision, tightening bolts on things that shouldn't be loose and watching the walls with a wary, exhausted intensity. They fill the gaps between my broadcasts, providing a thin veneer of office life. But sometimes, when the specialist starts its rhythmic, bone-grinding shriek, I catch them both freezing. Just for a second. Ashley's smile will falter, and Rick will grip his wrench until his knuckles turn gray. It was a Tuesday, indistinguishable from any other. I stepped into the booth, a cramped box that smelled of static and dust, and gave the specialist a soft pat on its cold, beige casing. It was my morning ritual, a way of acknowledging the beast before it woke up. Ashley fluttered in a moment later, clutching 2 foam cups. Her cheerfulness felt loud in the small space, like a radio played at the wrong frequency. "Ready for another fun day?" she asked, her smile pinned perfectly in place. "I guess you could call it that," I replied. The coffee she handed me was scalding, the steam curling into the air like a ghost. "Oh, Thomas," she giggled, backing toward the door. "I know there's a soft spot behind all that stone." I managed a faint roll of my eyes as she vanished back into the hallway. Left alone with the hum of the electronics, I turned to the window. It was one part of the job I actually liked. The parking lot was small, a gray patch of asphalt carved out of the dense, encroaching tree line. From here, I could watch the single road that bled into the forest. On mornings like this, with the mist clinging to the tops of the pines, it looked peaceful. But it was a fragile kind of peace, the kind you find in a graveyard before the first shovel hits the dirt. The trees stood so still they didn't look like wood and needles, they looked like a crowd of people standing perfectly silent, waiting for me to turn my back. I settled the headset over my ears, the plastic cool against my temples. In the background, Ashley's voice filtered through the monitors, bubbly, rhythmic, and utterly disconnected from the cold reality of the booth. I tuned her out. I was waiting for the only sound that mattered. Then, it came. The specialist didn't just print, it convulsed. A sharp, metallic shriek ripped through the room, the sound of a blade dragging across a chalkboard. A fresh tongue of thermal paper slid out, curling toward the floor. I grabbed it, my heart doing a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I leaned into the mic, giving it 2 soft taps. Thump thump. Like a heartbeat. "Good morning, everyone," I said, my voice dropping into that smooth, practiced tone. "Thomas here with the weather. It's going to be a gloomy one today. Expect light drizzling throughout the morning, with cooler temperatures moving in from the north." I read it word for word. I didn't breathe until the sentence was finished. I never dared to ad-lib, never dared to summarize. Even a normal report felt like a contract. If the specialist said drizzle, I said drizzle. If I changed a word, if I called it a shower instead of rain, I had the sickening feeling that the world outside would twist itself to fit my mistake, and I didn't want to be responsible for the sound of that snapping. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the slow crawl of shadows across the parking lot. No further updates shrieked from the specialist. It sat silent, a beige tombstone on my desk, radiating a dull, electric heat. Between her segments, Ashley leaned against my doorframe, chatting about nothing, local bake sales, a new song on the charts, the trivialities of a world that felt increasingly distant. We kept it light. We had to. Later than usual, Rick shuffled past the booth. He carried a heavy toolbox that clanked with the sound of rusted iron, his eyes fixed on a spot an inch above the floorboards. I didn't ask why he was late. He didn't explain. It was our unspoken contract, signed in the silence of the station. We didn't talk about the boss no one had ever met. We didn't compare notes on the phantom phone calls that had plucked us out of our lives and dropped us behind these desks. There was a comfort in ignorance. If I didn't ask Ashley how she got here, she wouldn't have to ask me why I was reading survival instructions to a city that thought I was just talking about the rain. We were 3 strangers holding our breath in the dark, pretending that if we just did our jobs, if Rick kept the pipes from screaming and I kept the script perfect, the dark wouldn't notice us. "So, Thomas, I was wondering if maybe you wanted to go to the farmer's market this Saturday?" Ashley's voice was different. The high-pitched, radio-ready giddiness had dipped into something softer, something fragile. She was looking at her shoes, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. It was the first time in years she'd acknowledged a world existing outside the 4 walls of this station. "Ah, sure," I replied, the words feeling heavy in my mouth. "Why not?" I told myself it was just the loneliness finally leaking through her armor. She looked up, and for a second, her smile wasn't a mask, it was real, bright enough to make the dim booth feel almost warm. "Wonderful," she beamed, a genuine spring in her step as she turned the corner. "I can't wait." I watched her go, actually feeling a phantom twitch of a smile myself. I'd pick her up a coffee tomorrow morning. A real one, from the place down the road, not the burnt sludge we drank here. I let myself imagine the sun on a Saturday morning. Then, the specialist screamed. It wasn't the usual screech. It was a prolonged, wet sound, like a saw blade hitting a knot of gristle. The air in the booth suddenly turned frigid, the scent of burnt oil replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of an approaching storm. The machine didn't just print, it shook the entire desk, vomiting out a strip of paper that looked charred around the edges. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know what kind of weather required a sound like that. But someone had to tell them. Someone had to try to save their lives. I reached for the paper, my fingers trembling. The heat coming off it felt like a fever. I smoothed it out on the desk and leaned into the microphone. My voice felt thin, a fragile thread of sound in the sudden, heavy silence of the station. "Attention, listeners," I began, my eyes scanning the jagged text. "Update for the overnight hours. We're looking at a sudden temperature inversion. A thick, localized fog will begin rolling in from the tree line starting at 6 p.m. Expect near zero visibility. I paused. The next line wasn't about barometric pressure or wind shear. It was printed in a larger, shakier font. The fog will carry the sound of a child crying for help. Do not go outside. Do not shine a light into the mist to find them. If the crying starts to sound like your own voice, cover your ears and stay away from the windows until sunrise. I sat there, the on-air light bleeding red across my knuckles. I thought of Ashley, her pep and her Saturday plans. I thought of the road leading out of the parking lot, currently being swallowed by a gray, unnatural tide. The specialist gave one final, wet click, a sound like a tongue snapping against the roof of a mouth, and went cold. 6 o'clock arrived with the heavy, mechanical thud of the station's clock. I caught Ashley and Rick by the heavy steel exit door. "The fog," I said, my voice sounding raspy even to my own ears. "Remember the report. Stay inside. Don't look for the source of the noise." They both nodded. Ashley's smile was gone, replaced by a tight, thin line of apprehension. Rick didn't even look at me, he just adjusted the strap of his heavy toolbox and pushed out into the evening. For the first time in 6 years, the unspoken contract felt like it was fraying at the edges. I cared if they made it home. I cared if I saw them tomorrow. When I stepped out, the air didn't hit me, it swallowed me. The fog wasn't a mist, it was a physical weight, tasting of wet ash and static. It clung to my skin, instantly soaking through my coat. The specialist's accuracy was a jagged blade, perfect and cold. I could barely see the hood of my car 10 feet away. Through the shifting gray curtains, I saw Rick. He was standing by the open door of his rusted truck, but he wasn't getting in. He was staring back at the radio station, his silhouette stunted and lonely in the haze. He looked smaller than usual, his shoulders slumped under a grief I couldn't name. I raised a hand to call out to him, to ask if he was okay, but the words died in my throat. The fog between us seemed to thicken, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic light that didn't come from any street lamp. Before I could find my voice, Rick climbed into the cab. The door shut with a hollow, final sound, and his taillights bled into the mist like two fading embers before vanishing entirely. I stood there in the silence, my hand still half raised, listening. And then, from somewhere deep in the tree line, I heard it. The first faint, thin wail of a child. I ignored the sounds in the fog. It's a skill I've perfected over 6 years, the ability to lock my empathy in a box and keep walking. By the time I reached my front door, the world was silent again. The specialist's rules only seem to apply when you're standing on its ground. The next morning, the world looked scrubbed clean. The fog had vanished as if it had never been, leaving the trees sharp and vivid against a pale sky. I left early, the engine of my car humming a cheerful tune as I pulled into the drive-thru of a local cafe. I bought 2 coffees, a plain black for myself and something lighter, sweeter, for Ashley. The warmth of the cups against my palm felt like a promise. I was actually looking forward to the station. I wanted to see her face when she saw the drink. I wanted to believe that people had listened to my voice last night, that they had stayed inside, covered their ears, and ignored the phantom cries in the mist. The coffee cup sat in the passenger seat, the sweet scent of Ashley's vanilla latte filling the car. I pulled into the station lot, my mind on the Saturday market, on the sun, on anything but the radio. Then the tires hit something soft. A wet, heavy thwack that didn't sound like a pothole. I slammed on the brakes. My stomach turned a cold somersault as I looked through the windshield. The parking lot wasn't gray anymore. It was a mosaic of raw, glistening meat and tangled limbs. They weren't just dead. They had been unmade. A dozen figures lay scattered across the asphalt, but the geometry was all wrong. I saw a man whose torso had been elongated and coiled like a length of garden hose, his ribs snapped outward to form a jagged, ivory cage. Next to him, a woman had been fused to the trunk of a pine tree, her skin stretched so thin it was translucent, revealing the frantic, pulsing machinery of organs that shouldn't have still been working. But it was the faces that made me scream behind my teeth. Their mouths were pulled open in impossible, yawning vertical ovals, the skin of their cheeks ripped back to the jawbone. Their eyes weren't just wide, the lids had been removed, leaving bulging, bloodshot spheres that stared at nothing. They looked exactly like the hollow-eyed agony of the scream, but rendered in shivering, wet muscle and bruised fat. The worst part was the sound. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, bubbling whistle coming from those cavernous mouths, the sound of air escaping through ruined windpipes. They were still breathing. The fog hadn't finished the job, it had just changed their shape. In the center of the carnage, I saw a familiar blue jacket. Rick. His body had been flattened down, as if all his bones were removed. His neck was stretched out like taffy wrapped around his rusty toolbox. I walked through the asphalt, and the ground felt spongy. I tried not to look down, but the wet squelch beneath my boots forced my eyes to the pavement. I hadn't stepped on a stone. I had stepped on a long, gray ribbon of muscle that trailed out from a pile of what used to be a local delivery driver. It was still twitching, tasting the air, even though the rest of the man was a flattened husk of shattered bone and burst intestines. I walked toward the entrance, my breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. To my left, two figures had been woven together. Their limbs had been braided like dough, the skin fused so seamlessly that I couldn't tell where one person ended and the other began. They looked like a human knot, a sculpture of purple bruising and exposed sinew. One of them turned a head that was mostly just a gaping, toothless hole, and a thick, yellow fluid leaked from its ear as it tried to moan. It sounded like air escaping a punctured tire. I passed the bike rack, where a teenager was draped like a wet towel. His spine had been removed God knows how, and his limp body was knotted through the metal bars. His eyes, fixed and glassy, followed me. He was nothing but a bag of fluid and meat now, yet his fingers continued to drum a rhythmic, mindless beat against the metal. Tap. 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 I reached the heavy steel doors of the station. My hand hovered over the handle, which was coated in a thin, translucent film of mucus. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I wiped my hand on my pants, gripped the slime-slicked handle, and pulled. Ashley was hunched over her desk, a small, trembling heap of floral print fabric in terror. Her breathing was a series of wet, hitching gasps, and her eyes were fixed on the security monitors, the small, grainy screens that showed the mosaic I had just walked through. I called the police already, she stammered, her voice a fragile whistle. She didn't look at me. She couldn't. I am so scared, Thomas. The bodies. Oh God, the bodies in the light. They're still moving. I just set the sweet, vanilla-scented coffee on the corner of her desk. The steam rose in a gentle plume, smelling of a world that no longer existed. I leaned down and gave her a kind, practiced smile, the sort of smile a mortuary director gives to the grieving. I gave her a small, stiff nod of encouragement. Drink up, Ashley, I said softly. It's going to be a long day. She looked at the cup as if I'd handed her a severed head. I didn't stay to see if she drank it. I had a schedule to keep. I turned and walked to my boots leaving faint, reddish-brown smears on the linoleum. The specialist was vibrating so violently now that the pens on my desk were dancing. The shriek it was emitting had shifted into something rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. The moment the booth door clicked shut, the world went silent. The violent tremors of the desk ceased, and the specialist sat bathed in the soft, clinical glow of my desk lamp. It looked almost innocent. Then it fed me the morning's work. First came a strip of standard thermal paper, white and sterile. I looked at it, sunny. High of 78. A perfect, golden day for the town. I looked out the window, and my breath hitched. The parking lot was empty. The mosaic of meat, the braided limbs, the yawning faces all gone. Even the blood had been licked clean from the asphalt. The sun was shining with a cruel, blinding brightness that made the morning's slaughter feel like a fever dream. Then the machine shuddered one last time and pushed out the second sheet. It didn't slide out, it slumped. It was a square of pale, cured leather, still warm and slightly damp. The edges were jagged, showing the faint, rhythmic marks of a serrated blade. There were no ink ribbons here, The words had been raised in welts, like a rash forming under the surface of the skin. "Do not let the weather in, Thomas." I didn't scream. I couldn't afford to. I set the skin face down on the desk, unable to look at the texture of it any longer. I reached for my headset, the plastic feeling alien and cold against my skin. My hands were steady, too steady. I leaned toward the microphone. The on-air light bled a deep, arterial red across my knuckles. I tapped the mesh. Thump thump. "Good morning, everyone," I said, my voice as bright and hollow as the sun outside. "Thomas here, and now, for the weather."